Okay, and before we start, I just want to introduce the other two panelists. Well, actually, I'm Chrissy Pettipas, so I work for the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries Aquaculture Program, and I am the New Bedford Regional Supervisor for the Shellfish Program. Gabe Lundgren works with me here in the Aquaculture Program. You want to put your video on and say hi, Gabe?
Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm actually on the road right now, but it's
We can't hear you if you're talking.
Oh,
Okay, so let's move on to Eric. Can we hear Eric? Eric is with the Department of Public Health.
Good evening, everyone.
Okay, maybe it's just me.
can anybody hear me now?
Eric, could you hear Gabe talking? You could. Okay, it's just me. Let's see if I can fix this. Okay, can we try this one more time, Gabe?
Hi, everybody. If you can hear me, put it in the chat. But it's good to be with you. I work with Chrissy on the aquaculture project, and the Vibrio aspect of it as well. I think a lot of you are familiar with me, but it's always a good opportunity to just kind of go through the important things of harvest and handling at the beginning of the season. But so happy to be with you.
Okay, thanks. And so Eric, I'm sorry, I won't make you repeat yourself if everybody heard you and I was the only one that didn't. So yes, I'm going to get started then. I'll share my screen and just let me know. That you can see everything okay. Okay. So we're good. Everybody can see shellfish harvest, handling, and Vibrio control. Okay, I'm going to assume that's a yes.
I'm not sure if the chat is functioning, Chrissy.
Okay, well, yours is. I saw yours say test, but now that I'm in presentation mode, it becomes difficult for me to see what's going on.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the attendees can actually access the chat.
Okay, so they may just have to use their hands then, raise hand function.
That's a great idea.
I got a text from one of the attendees that the chat is disabled.
Okay, let's see if we can fix that. Okay, it could be that when the webinar got set up, that was a default that I cannot change now since I didn't set up the webinar. Okay, so we may just have to, Gabe, I'm going to make you a co-host.
Okay.
So, if people have questions. You can allow them to speak. By just clicking the 3 dots next to their name in the attendees list. Okay, sorry about that, folks. I think we're good to get started now. Okay, so welcome. We're going to start talking about the upcoming 2023 Vibrio control season. We're also going to start with a little bit of basic shellfish harvest and handling that applies across the board all year long, regardless of the season. We'll get into some Vibrio background and then sort of the meat and potatoes of the Vibrio control. Okay, so basic harvest and handling checklist. The first thing is you should know your shellfish growing area where you're harvesting your product, whether you're wild harvesting or you're an aquaculturist with a grant site. And you should only be harvesting in areas that have an approved or conditionally approved classification and in the open status. So this QR code up here, it'll take you to the list of the Division of Marine Fisheries growing areas, and you can see all of the area classifications. And so the color code green will be approved and blue will be conditionally approved. Boats used in the harvesting must be kept clean and free of debris during harvest and transport of shell stock of your shellfish. You know, so this picture here, it's a poor picture of a harvest boat because nobody's going to be using a dinghy really to be harvesting their product, but it's a good example of a boat with very poor sanitary conditions. You know, there are birds, there's bird poop all over the boat. So that is not a boat that is up to the sanitary standards for harvesting. The shellfish on the boat should be stored in raised areas to prevent any contact with any bilge or chemicals that may be on the deck, fuel. The shellfish should be covered to prevent exposure to the sun or birds. And again, this is any time of year, any type of shellfish. Each harvest boat should have this sanitation device or container with a tight fitting lid that says human waste on it. That's actually something that's specifically spelled out in the National Shellfish Sanitation Program Model Ordinance, that it wants 3-inch letters and it has to say human waste. I know, you know, you don't really want onlookers watching you harvest oysters or any shellfish and see human waste on board, but that is a requirement. And of course, the containers need to be emptied into an appropriate sewage disposal system and cleaned. All of Massachusetts is a no discharge zone, so no waste should be discharged into our waters. And also, this one tends to be a sore spot, but dogs, cats, and other animals are not allowed on the harvest vessels or on aquaculture licensed sites. This is something that is required in the model ordinance. We have gotten some guidance from the FDA, and they consulted with the Americans with Disabilities Act office for service animals. And basically, long story short, is even service animals are not supposed to be where food is being handled and processed. There can be some allowances for service animals if they're kept physically excluded from where the product is being handled. For example, if you had a boat with a closed cabin, if you have a documented disability and have a trained service animal, that could be an allowance for you, but otherwise no animals are allowed on the harvest vessel. So if for aquaculturists, bulk tagging is allowed for culling and overwintering. Whenever you are moving any product on and off your site, whether it's for the market or not, it should have a tag on it. So we'll get into the harvester tag requirements later, but if you're just doing culture activities, a single green bulk tag that basically declares the disposition of your product. It should have your name, the permit holder's name, the shellfish aquaculture permit number, the date of removal, and location of your site, so the town, the water body. You want to identify the number of shellfish you're moving, whether by bags, individuals, pieces, or bushels. And you want to have one of the following statements: aquaculturally reared, to be culled or overwintering. So it means you're taking it from your site to whatever your off-site culling or overwintering spot is. And then the opposite, culled or overwintered for return to the licensed site. There is no direct marketing of shellfish from overwintering sites or land-based overwintering sites. All of the market-sized oysters that are overwintered need to go back to your aquaculture site and resubmerged at the site for a minimum of 14 days before it can be consumed. This is 4 days longer than the resubmergence required during the Vibrio control season, but that's kind of to allow for the shellfish to reacclimate because they've been sort of dormant on land outside of the water. And generally the temperatures are going to be cooler, and they may not be, the temperatures may not allow them to start pumping right away, depending on, when you put them back in the water. So it's 14 days. Okay, so we can get into what are Vibrio bacteria now. So Vibrio is a very diverse type of bacteria in the environment. It occurs naturally. It can be free living, or it can be associated with hosts. So we can be carriers. Lots of different animals in the ocean, the microscopic crustaceans of the ocean, can carry Vibrio. They're one of the fastest growing of all known bacteria, particularly at high temperatures. There are several pathogenic strains, but they're actually few in number compared to the total Vibrio parahemolyticus in marine water. So Vibrio parahemolyticus, or VP, is the species of Vibrio that is the subject of our Vibrio control plan in Massachusetts. Another species of concern is Vibrio vulnificus. Other states are required to have Vibrio vulnificus control plans. As of right now, we have not had any outbreaks of Vibrio vulnificus, and we do not have to control specifically for that at the moment. There are a couple of genes associated with Vibrio and pathogenic Vibrio, which you don't really need to know, but I just mention it here just in case you're reading the literature, and if you happen to be unfortunate enough to be subject to a Vibrio closure and want to look at literature, you have some background. So the thermolabile hemolysin, or TLH, it's a genetic marker for all Vibrio parahemolyticus. So if PCR tests, which is a type of DNA test, shows the TLH marker is present, it basically tells us, okay, Vibrio parahemolyticus is present, but it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about strain or whether it's a particularly pathogenic Vibrio. The two other genes, the thermostable direct hemolysin, TDH, or thermostable direct hemolysin related, TDH related genes, they are strongly correlated with virulence, human illness. It's not a perfect correlation. There are a lot of examples where we see illness where we don't necessarily have these pathogenic pathogenic genes present, but there is a strong correlation there. So the illness caused when humans consume seafood products that are contaminated with pathogenic Vibrios it's vibriosis, and it causes about 80,000 illnesses every year. More than half of that, 45,000, is from the consumption of VP contaminated food. The other half is usually wound infections. About 500 hospitalizations, 100 deaths per year in the US alone. So Vibrio parahemolyticus is the leading cause of seafood-borne illness, but the vast majority, 87% don't require medical intervention or medical care. People who get Vibrio probably don't always go to the hospital. It's actually estimated around 80% of Vibrio illnesses probably go unreported. And it's, most of us have gotten sick. We just kind of chalk it up to, I ate something bad. We're miserable for a couple of days with the typical gastrointestinal symptoms of diarrhea, vomiting, stomach cramping. The symptoms usually occur within 24 hours of ingestion and last about 3 days. Also, just so you know, so some of you may be aware, we do have a red tide going on. We have a paralytic shellfish poisoning bloom. Generally, if there's an illness due to a biotoxin, the onset of symptoms will be much faster. So we'll see it within hours as opposed to about 24 hours. So we can see it within 2 to 4 hours. So generally a 24-hour symptom onset is probably bacteria and Vibrio. Severe illness is very rare, and it typically occurs with people, generally older individuals with weakened immune systems, whose doctors probably recommend that they don't eat raw seafood in the first place, particularly oysters. So again, illnesses are associated with the consumption mostly of raw or undercooked seafood, and most of the illnesses are associated with oysters. Confirmed illnesses have been increasing, and it continues to be a public health challenge. On the lower left, I just wanted to show you that we do have a virtual epidemiologic network in Massachusetts called MAVEN, and it is run by the Department of Public Health, and this is basically a platform for tracking illnesses, and so that DPH and local boards of health can coordinate the traceback response. So our first Vibrio illnesses occurred in 2011, and we were required to have a Vibrio control plan when we have an outbreak. And so there are a couple definitions of outbreak, but the fastest and the simplest definition of an outbreak is 2 or more illnesses epidemiologically linked to oysters harvested on the same day from the same harvest area. So that triggered the Vibrio control plan when that occurred in 2011. So in 2012, we implemented our first Vibrio control plan, but it was only for Eastern Cape Cod Bay. And it wasn't until 2013 when we implemented the statewide Vibrio control plan. And you can see that in this lower plot to the left, lower left, after we had our initial couple of illnesses in 2011, in 2013, we really had the peak of our Vibrio illness in terms of sole source VP illnesses. And then, you know, after 2015, we started to implement some stricter icing requirements, particularly in the 2 areas that tended to be Vibrio illness hotspots. Those areas have a 1 hour to icing, which we'll get into in a little bit. But since then, we've kind of hovered around, 10 or so single source illnesses a year. We haven't had any outbreaks of Vibrio associated with commercially harvested clams from Massachusetts, and therefore we're not required to have a Vibrio control plan for clams. Let's hope we keep it that way. We don't want to have to implement a VP control plan for clams, but we do get some clam illnesses. They tend to be associated with self-harvest, recreational harvest, and probably, inappropriate handling, temperature abuse associated with that recreational harvest. And so the lower right plot shows in the blue the number of oyster pieces landed, million oyster pieces landed every year. I haven't been able to go through and quality control the 2022 data, so that this plot doesn't include 2022, but you can see that our landings in Massachusetts have been trending upward for well over a decade. We can see also the little dip here from the pandemic. But, even with that dip in sales, the illnesses kind of stayed steady. In fact, we were on a little local high in illnesses there in 2020. Okay, so the Vibrio control plan and implementing regulations at 322 CMR 1607. So as I said, because we had the Vibrio illness outbreaks in 2011, we now have the Vibrio control plan. Our Vibrio control season is from May 19th through October 19th, and it applies to all oysters greater than or equal to 2.5 inches. So if you're an aquaculturist, you are allowed to harvest and sell 2.5-inch oysters. If you are a wild harvester, your legal market size is 3 inches. So the 2.5 applies to aquaculturists. Otherwise, it's 3 inches. But anything going to market any oysters going to market have to abide by the Vibrio control plan. So this QR code over here takes you to the Division of Marine Fisheries Vibrio control webpage. It needs to be updated with the new 2023 information, but that will be happening soon. And this this presentation, this webinar will be uploaded, and there will be a link on the website as well. So you can get the QR code either now, you can take a picture on your, get it on your screen and get that website, now, or, at some point you can just Google our DMF website and get to it. Okay, so the primary control measure in the Vibrio control plan is cooling of oysters, and typically icing. We want to ice or put oysters in an ice slurry to start rapid cooling. And this table here pretty much shows you why. We can see that oysters coming out of the water at 50 degrees and around 50 degrees ambient temperature, it can take up over 35 hours for the Vibrio bacteria burden in the body of that oyster to double. Once we get to 70 degrees, we've dramatically decreased the doubling time to only 3 hours, and 90 and 100 degrees, we're doubling the Vibrio burden in the oyster in an hour or less. So the ice slurry is one method of icing your product. We can see here, this is a little case study on the ice slurry. In this particular case study, the oyster came out of the water at 90 degrees and pretty much hovered, a little over 90 until it went into the ice slurry. And then it had a precipitous decline and was to 50 degrees within 15 minutes. The ice slurry, basically ice and water that is either from a potable water source or from your growing area, from your harvest area in the open status. And it must be at or below 45 degrees. So people have asked, well, how much ice do I use? Whatever amount of ice it takes to get it to at or below 45 degrees. So if you're using your harvest area waters and your harvest area waters are 70 degrees, it's going to take more ice to get it to below 45 degrees than if you're using, potable water that's maybe 60 degrees. So you really should have a thermometer and be able to check that temperature, because unlike the direct icing method, temperature is the control metric. For direct icing, it's still effective, just not as effective as quickly as the slurry method. In this case study, the oyster came out of the water at 75 degrees, but because of high ambient temperature outside of the water, you can see that there is a very precipitous increase in the oyster temperature as soon as it got plucked out of the water. So this is the point of icing, and we can see that with the direct icing method, it took about 37 minutes for the oyster to get to 50 degrees. So for those who are not here for the first time and are familiar with last year's Vibrio control plan, the Vibrio working group got together and we have made some minor changes to the Vibrio control plan. It hasn't received its final approval up the chain yet, but when it does, we're presuming that it will. We've changed the definition of adequate icing just a little bit. So we were asked to maybe allow a little bit more discretion to use less ice. And so we did that by defining layer. So layer means a single thickness or coating spread out and continuously covering an entire surface. And we removed those very prescriptive language of at least 2 inches of ice between each bag and the bottom and size of the container, and 3 inches at the top of the container with just in a mesh bags containing oysters must be completely surrounded by ice, including the bottom of the container and each level of bags with a layer of ice that continuously and completely covers each shellfish bag. So again, use your judgment. If it's a 90-degree day, maybe that layer should be a little thicker than if it's a 50-degree day. But it should be a continuous layer. There shouldn't be gaps in the ice coverage. If it's loose oysters, again, we're looking for a continuous layer, and if you have the oysters loose in, say, a Bonar box, kind of use your discretion in terms of, you know, how many inches of oysters before you put a layer of ice. Probably be consistent with maybe 100 count bags. So maybe every 10 or 12 inches of loose oysters, you put a layer of ice. We want to make sure that immediate cooling is commenced. Okay, so Vibrio compliance monitoring at harvest. So shellfish constables and environmental police officers will be doing compliance checks, and they have a compliance monitoring form. And so these next few slides will be showing some of the questions on that form, and the questions in red are actually critical violations. So the two critical violations are tagging and improper icing. And so for tagged shellfish, all the containers need to have a tag that have the time of harvest, the time of icing, if you're not using a bulk tag, which we'll get into in a minute, but if you only have 3 bags, say, you would want, you know, the time of icing on every individual tag, the harvest date, the harvest area, and the harvester ID. The harvest area needs to include the initials MA for Massachusetts, and the harvest area should have the most precise area. So this one just says CCB 11. If you look at your growing areas, there are sub-classifications, and your growing area may have some areas that are prohibited and in the closed status. And so you want to make sure you're stating that you harvested it in an area in the open status. So it really should have the exact designation. And of course, you know, the quantity of shellfish. All containers in transit, whether wild harvested or aquaculture harvested, need to have a tag, again, whether it's intended for market or not. So we talked about the alternative green tag. And the tag must have the information specified above and also in 322 CMR 16005. So time of harvest, let's get into some definitions. So all commercial fishermen or aquaculturists need to accurately record the time of harvest for each harvester lot of market-bound oysters. So what's a harvester lot? A lot is your container or containers of oysters that are identified as having the same time of harvest, a single defined growing area, and a single harvester, whether it's a wild harvester or aquaculturist. And market bound means that the oysters are being removed from a shellfish growing area by a commercially permitted harvester, and it's intended to go to a dealer on that same calendar day. So time of harvest is a little bit different if you're harvesting from a subtidal area versus an intertidal area. If you're in a subtidal area, the time of harvest is when you pluck that first oyster from the water. If you're in an intertidal area, if you're in an intertidal area during Vibrio control season, you can only harvest during the ebb tide. So when the water is falling, because we want to make sure that it's had a complete soak during the flood tide after it had been exposed from the prior ebbing or low tide. And if you're in an ebb tide and your product or your site hasn't been exposed yet, then your time of harvest is when you pluck the first oyster out of the water. But if your product had been exposed by the tide prior to you actually harvesting, your technical time of harvest is when it got exposed. So if it got exposed at 7 a.m., but you're not actually going to grab the product till 8 a.m., that time of harvest is 7 a.m. And that is the time that you use for counting your time to icing. If you're in the summer and you're in the intertidal and the exposure time is such that it occurred before dawn, but you have there's enough time for, if you have 2 hours to icing to actually harvest. If you put the nighttime time of harvest, you will not get in any way cited for having a nighttime time of harvest. As long as you're not physically harvesting it in the night, you want to accurately put the exposure time. So more Vibrio compliance. So as I mentioned, are oysters adequately iced? That is a critical violation if your oysters are not adequately iced. You also have to adequately shade your oysters. As soon as you harvest your oysters, you want to make sure that you are shading it from direct sunlight and any exposure to birds flying overhead. So all fishermen and aquaculturists need to shade immediately following harvest and until the oysters are adequately iced. We consider sort of best practices to be having your shading material elevated above your head so that it's not in direct contact with the oysters. This actually allows airflow and minimizes the risk of heating, if you particularly if it's a hot sunny day. But if you are going to use materials that come in direct contact with the oysters, they must be smooth, easily cleanable, and impervious to water so that we can avoid contamination. So some people are using, plastic tarps. That's fine. But we've also seen people try to use burlap sacks. That's not fine. And it isn't easily cleanable, and in all likelihood is introducing bacteria to your product. So icing requirements. Now we're going to get into some of the specifics of the icing. So again, we've sort of refined our definition of what it means to have adequately iced your product. So for the vast majority of growing areas in the state, all fishermen and aquaculturists need to adequately ice oysters within 2 hours from the time of harvest or exposure if in the intertidal, or prior to leaving the landing point, whichever's first. So if you're really close to your landing point and your harvest time was only a half an hour ago and your dealer is only a half an hour away, that doesn't mean you don't have to ice because you're going to get it to the dealer within 2 hours. You actually have to ice before leaving the landing point, even if you do have an extra hour leeway. For certain areas, there are more strict time to icing. And so from July 1st through September 15th, all oysters harvested in growing areas CCB 42, 43, 45, 46, 47, and V20. So basically that's the Plymouth, Duxbury, Kingston 3-bay system and the CCBs. And V20 is Katama Bay in Duxbury, in Edgartown. And this is because historically they've been associated with Vibrio illnesses. They've been Vibrio illness hotspots. So unfortunately, they have even less wiggle room for their time to icing. So oysters must be adequately iced until received by the wholesale dealer. There is an exemption, which we'll get into a little bit later. DPH let me steal this slide from them. They presented it to us at an earlier meeting, but I think it's a nice little compilation of the 2022, last year's Vibrio control season. So 41 Massachusetts residents were investigated with Vibrio parahemolyticus or Vibrio species. So sometimes when people get sick and go to the hospital, the diagnostic tests don't always determine the species. They just tell us it's Vibrio, but not necessarily that it's Vibrio parahemolyticus. So that particular tool called CIDT, Culture Independent Diagnostic Testing, ends up giving us sort of just Vibrio and not this, if it's not whether it's VP. So of those, 80% reported consuming raw oysters, and 28 out of the 35 had the information available. So in this top pie plot here, the blue shows that 43% of those Massachusetts illnesses were single in-state. The orange shows that they were multiple in-state. So what multiple means and what single means is that they were traced back to a single growing area. So when they went to the retail place, it's usually a restaurant, looked at the tags, traced it back to a dealer, traced it back to the harvester, and they could, with a good degree of confidence, say the oysters that caused this sickness came from, CCB 45, say. In multiple in-state, that means that the illness traced back was associated with potentially multiple growing areas. And that there could be a couple of reasons for that. It could be that the restaurant had multiple harvest lots on hand and they didn't really know which lot ended up on the plate. Or often what happens is restaurants have a medley plate. So you can get a medley plate of oysters. You want to try a Wellfleet oyster, a Duxbury oyster. And so since there are more than one type of oyster on the plate, we don't know which one got the person sick. So that's a multiple source trace back. We also have combinations of in-state and out-of-state, and we have some illnesses that trace back to oysters that were completely harvested out of state. So the bottom map, I think this is an important map because one thing that we keep getting asked is, well, can't Plymouth, Duxbury, Kingston, and Edgartown go back to 2 hours to icing just like everybody else? And we just continue to see those two areas be hotspots. And so last year, again, those were the only two areas with 3 or more single source illnesses associated with them. So at this time, we're not ready to roll back the 1 hour to icing for those areas. Okay, so this is a little bit of a recap of what was already stated because I wanted to show you the changes in the line items of the Vibrio control plan. But basically, the oysters have to be adequately iced. Now we're saying a continuous layer. So at the top of the oysters and between layers of bags. And again, layers, if it's loose oysters, use your judgment. Again, if it's a 90-degree day, you probably want to use more ice because it's not going to do, you're not going to do yourself any favors if we don't get that rapid cooling and we end up with illnesses because we may have to close you down. And again, oysters held in the ice slurry, the ice and water mixture, we need to make sure that the temperature is of the water mixture is at or below 45 degrees. And as we said, it's very effective. The FDA came last year to evaluate Massachusetts implementation of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. And it was a 90-degree day. There weren't too many people harvesting. But the few that they did see harvesting utilized the slurry method, and they documented ice getting down to temperature within 10 minutes. So our harvesters were doing a good job that day, and made the harvester end look, implementation of the Vibrio control plan on the harvester end looked great. So thank you. So we do have an exemption to icing, and that's if the wholesale dealers take on the burden of initial icing at the landing spot. So basically they have to ice it the way you would have been, made to ice it, but you are still responsible for verifying that they adequately iced, and you have to write that time of icing, the accurate time of icing on the icing tag. Okay, so let's get into the tags. So again, time of icing means when the last oyster or bag of oysters in the harvester lot is placed in the shellfish icing container and adequately iced. So either you have every single bag or individual container with the harvester tag that contains the icing time on it, or you have the option to use a single harvester icing tag for the purpose of meeting the icing, the icing requirements. If you have a large lot, it's pretty much impossible to comply with the icing requirement for individual tagging, because if you have a big lot and you're not supposed to you have to have the accurate time of icing, you don't know what your time is going to be until you finish the top, and then what are you going to dig up? It's just an impossible task. So you can just use a single harvester icing tag, bulk icing tag, and put it on your container. You just need to make sure that it adequately represents the number of bags in that container or individual pieces in that container, and it has all the same information that the individual tags have, only this one tag will also have the time of icing. So the use of the single harvester tag does not exempt commercial fishermen and aquaculturists from attaching the harvester tags. Again, they still have to have individual tags that have all the other information on all the individual containers of market-bound shellfish. The only exception to that is those few aquaculturists who are also dealers. There is a a special condition that they can have on their permits. We have been utilizing a letter of authorization, but when they're selling to themselves, we don't make them put 100 harvester tags to take those harvester tags out, sell it to themselves, and then put, 100 dealer tags. So for those few harvesters who are both aquaculturists and dealers, there is a special exception for them with special permission. Okay, so transport. So all market-bound oysters need to be transported by the commercial fisherman or aquaculturist directly to the primary buyer's physical facility or received by the primary buyer at the landing site. All harvesters are prohibited from handling or holding market-bound oysters at any unlicensed facility prior to receipt by the primary buyer. So you can't take it home. Certainly not if you're planning on marketing that product that same day. Another thing to keep in mind, this isn't explicitly a requirement on you, but because it's on the dealer, it technically is a requirement for you. So all oysters have to be received by the primary buyer and checked to be at or below 45 degrees within 10 hours of the time of harvest in order for them to be in compliance with their hazard analysis critical control point plan, or HACCP plan. So if you don't get it to the dealer within 10 hours, they should be rejecting it. So that pretty much makes that a requirement for you, even though it's not an explicit violation for you to not get it to the dealer within 10 hours. So no offsite culling of market-bound product prior to delivery. So if you offsite cull, unless your offsite culling is on another licensed site within the same growing area, then if you offsite cull, it needs to be returned to the site and resubmerged for 10 days, and we'll get into resubmergence. There's no holding overnight for AM delivery when harvesting on late tides. Again, when you harvest, it goes straight to the dealer, either at the landing point or straight to their facility. And the transaction cannot be unaccompanied. So the transaction needs to happen between the dealer or their employee and the harvester or the harvester's employee. If you're an aquaculturist, you can have the Division of Marine Fisheries offers free employee transaction cards so that your employees can land product at a dealer facility for you. But again, both parties need to be present. Okay, logbooks. So we're going to provide all harvesters with logbooks. We actually do it through the Shellfish Constables. We generally get the Shellfish Constables the number of logbooks they need, and they distribute it for us. The logbooks need to be on the site. If you're on the site, even if you're not harvesting, you should have your logbook with you, or on your vessel, at the site, or on your truck on the flat, where, however that works for you. You need to make sure that you're recording in indelible ink. I know some people are frustrated because they feel like we should be able to have an electronic version of the logbook, but this really is a record, particularly when there are illnesses and we need to do tracebacks. We don't want you to be able to put something out in the field and then change it later. So it needs to be written at the time of harvest or at the time of resubmergence. Everything needs to be recorded in that logbook in indelible ink, and you need to have it with you. We make the logbook with weatherproof paper. We get some that are pretty beaten up. We understand they're out in the field, but we've never really received a logbook is so beaten up that it wasn't still an adequate record of your harvests and resubmergence activities. So this is the front cover of the logbook. Again, reach out to your Shellfish Constable, or feel free to reach out to Gabe or myself, and we can get you your logbook. And here's an example of the inside of the logbook. Okay, so every page pretty much looks the same. We have a top table and we have a bottom table. The top table is for all market bound. So it's all your market records, your sales records. We have the date of harvest, the harvest area. We have your site number. Some of you have more than one site, so you want to make sure that you're documenting which site you're harvesting from. And if you're a wild harvester, you can write W. And then we want the quantity. So preferably in pieces, but if you're harvesting in bushels, just make sure we understand, you write down and record what unit you're actually reporting here. We want the time of harvest or first exposure, the time of icing, and then we want you to list the dealer. Now, if you are taking product home for personal consumption, you can write PC. You really should be icing, even if you're taking it home for yourself. One thing to note here is that technically you shouldn't be donating any product. Even donated product is supposed to go to a dealer. So really the only two entries you should have here is to a dealer or personal consumption if you're going to be, consuming it at your own home. A couple of things I want to point out here. So some red flags, CCB 42. We see here that this was harvested on July 8th, and we see that there's an hour and a half between time of harvest and time of icing. So this is actually a violation from that particular area because they're supposed to have it iced within an hour. The other thing is something that the FDA has kind of pointed out to us. The expectation is that exact times are documented, exact time of harvest, exact time of icing. And if you have rows after rows or column after column of all zeros or quarter past the hour or half past the hour, it's considered suspect that those aren't exact times and they're just sort of estimates. So just keep that in mind. You want it to be exact times, and this is suspect to have them always be zeros or fives at the end. Okay, so the lower table is for resubmergence activities. So again, if you're going to be culling product or the product is out of the water for more than 2 hours and it's not the natural tidal cycle. So if you're in an intertidal cycle and they're naturally exposed the way they will be every day, then you don't have to resubmerge for 10 days. You just can't harvest until the following ebb tide. But if you take it off your site, or if you're in a subtidal site and you violate the 2 hours to icing, then you have to resubmerge it on your site. You have to tag it separately. You have to segregate it from any product that may be marketable and keep it there for 10 days to depurate any elevated Vibrio levels they may have assumed from being in the ambient temperatures. So again, we want the date that it's removed from site, the date it's resubmerged, harvest area, identify the site, the number of the quantity, the containers. So how are you putting this back on your site? And then we have categories. So categories 1 and 2. So 1 is air drying for anti-fouling. So some of you will leave your product out to air dry for a couple of days to get some of those biofouling organisms off them. And there's also culling activities. So those 2 categories, 1 and 2, you can just do, you're utilizing the logbook to keep track of it. You can segregate it, resubmerge it. When the 10 days are up, remove the resubmergence tag, and then you can market it. The other 2 categories are non-compliance at the original dealer, or if there's a recall because we have an illness outbreak and we have to close down your growing area. In those 2 cases, non-compliance and recall, you do need permission from DMF. So we expect a phone call saying, hey, I just got a call from my dealer. They said the refrigerator broke down and they want to, they can't sell it because now it's non-compliant product. So, can I put this back on my site and resubmerge it? And so generally we'll connect with the Shellfish Constable, make sure that activity is witnessed and overseen, and then, you'll be fine. And of course, recall. And recall will generally be specific to Vibrio. There are different types of recall. So, I mentioned earlier, we have a biotoxin closure going on. If we recall product due to a biotoxin closure, that stuff cannot be put back on your site. That product is going to have to be destroyed. So again, in those cases, you want to reach out and ask before it gets put back on the site. So culling, sorting, air drying, and resubmergence. Let's get into that a little bit more. So all of these restrictions apply only to aquaculturists because wild harvesters just aren't allowed to do any of this. It's, they get it on the boat after harvest, it's supposed to go straight to the dealer or meet the dealer at the landing. So harvesters, again, oyster culture activities means any activity conducted by the aquaculturist that require the removal of the oysters from the waters and the licensed site for any of those reasons I mentioned. So market-sized oysters may be brought on board barges, boats, floats, and other floating structures for the purpose of culling or culture activities. This is an example of a culling float within the same growing area. So if it's in the growing area, all the oyster activity that is not conducted on the licensed site, but conducted within the growing area, and it needs to be special, it needs to be documented on the propagation permit. As long as the culture activities don't exceed 2 hours, you can cull, take some product to market, and then the other product can go back on your site, and the product that goes back to the site that didn't violate the 2 hours can be harvested the next calendar day. If you violated the 2 hours, it needs to be resubmerged for 10 days. And again, if you're in Plymouth, Duxbury, Kingston, or Edgartown within that 1 hour window, then it's 1 hour rather than 2. And so again, if they don't exceed, then it can get brought back to the site and harvested on the next day. And again, you do need to document this. So you want to make sure, even if you're culling, you want to keep track of the time. So you want to, mark, well, okay, this is when I took it out of the water, and you want to document that you didn't exceed the 2 hours. Okay, so resubmergence, off-site culling practices. So if you take the oysters off-site, a lot of you have land-based off-site culling. As soon as it leaves the water, it's considered off-site culled. Once it hits land, it's considered off-site culled, and you need to resubmerge for 10 days prior to being able to harvest anything off the site. Again, in intertidal areas, if you're working your site during the period when it would normally be exposed anyway, then you don't have to go by the, oh, well, they were exposed for 2 hours, because you wouldn't be able to harvest at all during the Vibrio control season, because every low tide cycle would expose it for more than 2 hours, and you'd have to resubmerge for 10 days. But oysters in the intertidal have acclimated to being exposed and then resubmerged at that cyclic cycle that, they end up, they start pumping right away, and we find that they actually purge themselves faster than oysters in the subtidal. So as long as you're working your site when it normally would be exposed, you don't have to worry about keeping track of the time for resubmergence. And again, use a stopwatch or document the time. You're expected to really keep track of those times when you're working the oysters during the Vibrio control season. So again, resubmergence of non-compliant oysters. Again, in the event of a recall due to illness, you may be allowed to resubmerge product, but that will only be allowed for oysters that did not leave your primary buyer's facility. If that dealer sold it to another dealer and that second dealer's refrigerator broke down, that product's going to have to get destroyed. And again, resubmergence can only be conducted by aquaculturists that have a propagation permit, and it's not allowed to occur with wild harvesters. And there's no holding of wild oysters on an aquaculturist site either. So we know Wellfleet, they have a very robust wild oyster harvest. So a lot of their growers do both. They culture oysters and they wild harvest. So you can't, wild harvest oysters and then hold it on your site. Only oysters that are, bought as seed and grown on your site, unless you have a special I'm losing the word here, sorry. Unless your permit allows you to collect spat from the wild, that spat could be grown on your site. Endorsement, that's the word I was missing. So if you are endorsed to collect wild spat, that is the only exception to wild product being able to be brought on your site. Okay, so we can get into the Vibrio logbook again. Just make sure you have it on you at all times when you're on your site or handling product on your boat. So non-compliant oysters. So we gave you a couple of examples of when non-compliant oysters can be returned to your site and resubmerged. However, if the non-compliance is due to a violation, sort of a blatant violation of the control measures, such as no tag, improper tag, the tag doesn't have the appropriate information, or no icing, or not adequately iced, your oysters in all likelihood are going to get destroyed. Now, there is officer discretion, particularly when we had the more prescriptive definitions of adequate icing. You know, if an officer came and, you know, checked out your lot and said, you don't have 3 inches on the top, you know, an officer probably said, put a little bit more ice, and allowed you to take corrective action right on the spot. But if it's not iced at all, chances are they're not going to, you know, let you correct that on the spot. And again, you know, why? Because you're not just affecting yourself, you're affecting public health. And if there is an illness, you're affecting your neighbors. So if we have to close the area around, you know, close the area, all of your neighboring aquaculturists or wild harvesters, they're going to be affected by your poor decisions. And typically one of the easiest ways to destroy is just to pour bleach on the oysters and then you know, just dispose of them in some upland location. We do have some grower harvest and handling training videos made online. So I had the QR code to our website, our Vibrio website. So there is a link to these on that website. But if you want to take the your camera and capture that QR code, it'll take you straight to the videos as well. One thing to keep in mind is that these videos are a little outdated. Here's, you know, one of the more important outdated aspects is that it still says 14 days. So when these videos were made, resubmergence during the Vibrio control period had to be for 14 days. It is now 10 days. So just keep that in mind, that you want to refer to the Vibrio control plan for the specifics. But these training videos are a good resource for you know, knowing the general requirements of the Vibrio control plan. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out that there are some proactive Vibrio parahemolyticus tools. So NOAA has on their National Coastal Centers for Coastal Ocean Science website. And again, the QR code is there if you want to grab it. They have some models that can predict a doubling time and predict what the best harvest window is for the following day. So if you think you want to harvest tomorrow, you can go on that website and it'll give you the temperature prediction, and it'll show you the harvest window that is associated with the least risk of Vibrio illness. You know, so if you're in an intertidal site, you're also constrained by the tide. But if you're in a subtidal site and you can, you know, move your harvest window a little easier, then maybe utilizing this tool would be a great option for you. And just in general, again, if it's 90 degrees out, it's a high risk time for consuming oysters. And if you can shift your harvest to maybe the day after, if it's cooler, that might be a good bet for you. Because if we end up getting an outbreak, and again, it's not a very high bar. All it takes is one family sitting down and 2 of them getting sick on oysters that can be traced to a single source, to a single growing area. So again, just, you know, do your best, use your best judgment. The key thing is we want to get immediate cooling, and the icing doesn't actually kill the Vibrio. It just prevents further growth. So we're just trying to mitigate this further growth, minimize the Vibrio burden within the oysters, and you know, make it as safe as possible. Having said that, inevitably, when I have to call people and, you know, inform them that there's been an illness from someone consuming their oysters, it's typically, you know, the person's very upset. They're like, oh, I did everything right. And I'm sure you did. So understand, you could be doing everything right. You can ice perfectly, and you could still get some Vibrio illnesses because some people are just more susceptible to illness than others. And, you know, in August, it's a high risk time because of the temperatures. So we get illnesses every year. It could be you, even if you are doing everything right. So just keep in mind, if you have an illness, we'll just contact you. We'll ask to see your Vibrio logbook, make sure you're icing, you know, in the appropriate time frame. And you know, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand now.
Great job, Chrissy. Sorry that the chat does not work, everyone, but feel free to raise your hands.
Okay, well, if nobody has any questions, Gabe or Eric, did you want to add anything?
Not really. I think you were pretty thorough, Chrissy. Great job. I'll just add that, you know, Department of Public Health really does appreciate the high level of compliance with the Vibrio control plan, especially in the last couple of years. You know, I think industry continues to perform at a very high standard. That's been noted by FDA. We realize it's a lot of work. We hope that the changes we made to the adequate icing portion of the plan, you know, benefit you, save you some money and some aggravation. You know, we actually invested some time in researching this with other state Vibrio control plans, and this is consistent with what Virginia, New York, Rhode Island, Washington, and other states that have a history of Vibrio. This is, you know, consistent with what they do in their plans. If at any time you have any questions, you know, about the Vibrio control plan, certainly Chrissy and Gabe are available, but, you know, don't be shy about contacting Food Protection Program. I'm happy to answer questions, particularly, you know, in the realm of, you know, wholesale dealer part of the plan. Just to kind of give an update on what DPH will be doing here in the coming weeks. We're very close to getting sign off on the Vibrio control plan. I'm already putting together an email blast list. We'll be sending out an email with a copy of the final plan, the HACCP plans, and the HACCP record templates to all our wholesale dealers that have a shellfish endorsement and a primary buyer endorsement. So it'll be any firm, whether they're ISSL or not, that will be purchasing shellfish directly from harvesters. So that will be happening in the very near future. And then we'll be sending out inspectors who will be checking in with our licensed wholesale dealers and, you know, providing hard copies of the plan, answering any questions that may come up. The other thing we're going to be doing is meeting with the environmental police in the coming weeks, you know, to discuss some of the finer points of the plan, particularly the changes to the adequate icing. You know, it is something that's a little different from the existing DMF regs. That's an adjustment that's going to have to occur in the coming year. In the meantime, you know, we're going to, you know, talk about adequate icing and explain that, you know, this is something that, you know, requires officer and inspector discretion. So again, you know, we hope you find the changes to adequate icing useful. And, you know, thanks again for all your, you know, your cooperation and support the last, I don't know, 12 years with Vibrio here. And we hope you have a successful, you know, summer, and that we have a very dull Vibrio season.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
great.
Oh,
No,
wait a minute.
I think
we have
I
a
think
question.
that, oh, we do. We have a question from Jeff.
Okay. Jeffrey, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, good evening. Thank you, Chrissy, for another wonderful presentation, and Gabe and Eric. This is a question we've had for, we were gonna ask it last year, but we're asking it now. Let's say the buyer has ordered 1,000 oysters, and we have to go through 3 cages with subtitle. The first cage we haul, we pull 600 market bound oysters out of it and resubmerge the non-legal size oysters. Can we hang those market size oysters off the raft? And would that be considered resubmergence if they are resubmerged but not back on the bottom? And then go get another cage and get the other 400 and then combine them both to get the 1,000 for market bound oysters for the next day. I'm not sure if I. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think I know what you're asking. We had a similar question at one of the in-person. So you're saying if you had to remove it from the water, but then you put it right back in. And so,
Right.
what is the actual time of harvest for that lot? Is it when that first sort of batch came out of the water, or is it when you finally take them all out?
Well, the time of harvest would be tomorrow because we would resubmerge them for when they wanted them. Well,
Oh.
we were just doing some on-site culling, but the first cage had an hour and a half on it, and then hung them in a bag or bags off the raft, not back to the bottom, but were resubmerged. And then the
Yep, as long
second,
as you don't violate the 2 hours. If you don't violate the 2 hours, then you don't have to resubmerge for 10 days. And so you can just have them hanging on your raft, and then the next day, pluck all of them. And
gotcha,
then, when you pull them all off, that'll be your time of harvest the next day. But
great.
if
I
it
think
takes you more than 2
that's
hours,
efficient.
then you
Yeah,
have to
it's 10 days.
resubmerge for 10 days.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we will say good night. Thank you for joining us. And again, please reach out to any of us, Gabe, Eric, or myself. We're happy to answer any questions, and whatever you need, just give us a shout. Okay. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
Good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Take care.